Good morning. I'm going to be looking at Jonah chapter 2 again today. Jonah is in the fish that God has appointed. He's been swallowed by the fish. The Lord provides or appoints a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And then chapter 2 of Jonah. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord." And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Jonah has been swallowed by the fish. He's heading downwards, away from God. But all under the Lord's control. The Lord is the one who's appointed the fish to swallow Jonah and preserve his life. Jonah's life is at rock bottom. When you're at the bottom, it's said that the only way is up. But the problem is, we can't raise ourselves up, spiritually speaking. We are lifeless idolaters. We need resurrection. And Jonah knows that. Look at his prayer. Jonah knows that God is in sovereign control. It's Yahweh who's hurled him into the deep, the heart of the seas. Jonah doesn't blame the sailors or nature or chance. He knows he is where he is because the Lord has placed him there. Jonah has been banished from the sight of the Lord, and he knows that this is all he deserves. He deserves death. Ironically, this is exactly what Jonah had wanted, to flee from the Lord's presence, and he receives what he wants. But it's not what he expected. It means death. Look at verse 5. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. Jonah knows that only the Lord can raise him up. He's impotent. Jonah says salvation belongs to the Lord and no one else. And the Lord works to save. Jonah, verse 6, the last part of the verse. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. So Jonah celebrates the Lord's goodness, his hesed, his faithful, committed, covenant love to Jonah, the grace that is mentioned in verse 8. He celebrates that he is the recipient of the Lord's salvation as he anticipates his saving through the fish. And verse 8, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. This is double-edged, because Jonah speaks truth in this verse. We go back to chapter 1. The sailors had cried out to all their gods and found no voice calling back, no peace from the storm, no grace. Metal and wooden statues have no power. They can't speak, they're dumb. There's no grace. To worship them is to forfeit grace. But just as the sailors in the end had turned to God and found grace, they'd found salvation in the storm, so Jonah has finally turned to God and found his grace. But grace, God's salvation of us, is grace, undeserved, freely given, not worked for. It's grace. So in these words, it's interesting to think about Jonah's tone of voice. When he says, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs, what is he meaning? Is he sad that there are so many who worship dumb and powerless idols and forfeit God's grace and salvation? Or is he triumphant that he now worships God, in contrast to the wicked people who worship idols? Or is it a mixture? Does he have John Newton's attitude, who wrote, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." John Newton was a slave trader. He turned away from that. He realized what he'd been doing. And he was rescued by God in a storm whilst at sea. His life was turned around. God's grace to him changed him. He became an abolitionist. He knew that all people of whatever race are made in God's image and to be respected. He knew that all people can call on the name of Jesus and be saved. Because salvation is nothing to do with an inherent superiority, something deserved. It's grace. It's a gift that should humble us and lead us to say the words of verse 8 as a prayer and request that God would open people's eyes, that they might come to see that salvation belongs to the Lord. Jonah hasn't yet been brought to that place, but may we be brought to that place. May we recognize God's grace, God's riches at Christ's expense to us, that it might humble us